I used to think being engaged to a woman like Emily Carter was a curse, because even though she was breathtakingly beautiful, she couldn't speak, and in my twisted sense of amusement I always left her behind just so I could hide somewhere and secretly watch her cry with those reddened eyes, thinking I had the upper hand, thinking I was in control, but I didn't realize how wrong I was until the day her voice suddenly returned, and instead of the fragile mute fiancé I thought I could bully, I woke up one night chained to the bed, her silky white stockings shoved into my mouth, and her soft laugh brushing against my ear as she whispered, "Hey hubby, you've bullied me for so long, isn't it time I collect some interest?" And in that terrifying yet strangely intoxicating moment I knew my life had flipped upside down, but that was only the beginning. Because after our whirlwind civil registration and the over-the-top Carter wedding package that my greedy family pushed through to secure the Carter fortune, I was unceremoniously thrown into the Carter estate, locked in a lavish bedroom with guards warning me that if I dared try to run, they'd break all three of my legs, and as I sat there dazed a flood of memories not my own came crashing into me, and I realized with bone-deep horror that I had transmigrated into a novel, not as the cool male lead but as the pathetic second male character, Ethan Reed, the so-called loyal dog who existed only to lick the boots of the female lead. Vanessa Carter, Emily's half-sister, while betraying his own wife Emily and ultimately helping Vanessa burn her alive in the fire that marked the tragic climax of the story, and the more I recalled the original plot the more I wanted to vomit, because what kind of idiot would throw away a goddess like Emily just to grovel for Vanessa, a manipulative illegitimate daughter with more ambition than class? And the thought that my in-laws had willingly handed me over just to exchange me for a fat dowry made me sick to my stomach. But then I saw her, Emily Carter herself, and I swear my entire world paused, because the woman in front of me wasn't just beautiful, she was unreal, skin so pale it seemed like a touch would bruise her, eyes so clear they reflected the world, lips trembling with a shy kind of stubbornness, and in that instant I almost forgot to breathe, thinking to myself like a fool, if she were my wife for real I would never let go, and when the housekeeper Maria rushed in to protect her, scolding her for running out because, "Your husband hates you so much, what if he hurts you?" I nearly choked on air, because wait a damn minute, this goddess was my wife. My so-called, mute burden, fiancé. Good lord, the original Ethan must have had brain damage, to look at this woman every day and still choose to be Vanessa's lapdog, and when I glanced down at my phone and saw that the wallpaper was Vanessa's picture, I almost wanted to smash it on the floor. Because sure, she was kind of cute in a soft harmless way, but compared to Emily it was like comparing a candle to the sun, so I swore to myself right there, forget the plot, forget the novel, if the world expected me to abandon Emily, then screw the world, even if it meant walking through fire, I'd never let her be harmed again, and that resolve burned hotter in my chest when I followed her into the Carter family banquet that evening, because there she was, the legitimate heiress, standing quietly in the corner, ignored by everyone, while Vanessa, the illegitimate daughter, sat surrounded by flatterers, preening like a peacock, and when her eyes met mine she sneered in disgust, probably remembering how the original me used to trail after her like a piece of gum on her shoe, but then she decided to go further, smiling slyly as she stretched out a leg and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Brother-in-law, my shoes are dirty," clearly intending to humiliate Emily by making me kneel and clean her shoe in public, just like the original Ethan had done eagerly in the novel, destroying both his and Emily's dignity, but I wasn't about to play that clown. Oh no, so I put on an obedient face, stepped forward as if to comply, then subtly tripped a passing waiter, sending an entire tray of red wine crashing down all over Vanessa's designer dress, and while she shrieked in outrage I feigned shock, saying innocently, "Oh no, it was just an accident, so many people watching. Surely you wouldn't risk your reputation over something so small, right, sister-in-law?" And the crowd immediately caught the sarcasm, because everyone knew Vanessa's background. An illegitimate child raised by a mistress could hardly claim good breeding, and when her face turned dark and she was about to explode, Emily suddenly stepped forward and stood protectively in front of me, saying nothing, just staring at her with those calm unblinking eyes until Vanessa faltered, her bravado deflating. And finally Emily's lips moved silently but I could read them, "Apologize." And Vanessa froze because she knew damn well Emily still held the majority of Carter Holdings shares, and without Emily's approval she was nothing but a decorative pawn, so with her teeth grinding she bowed her head and muttered, "I'm sorry, brother-in-law, while I stood there basking in a mix of triumph and warmth, because this woman, my wife, had protected me, and she deserved a husband who would shield her from the flames of fate, not deliver her into them. So that night, as everyone settled into guest rooms in the mansion, Emily and I were given a shared suite, though she wordlessly pointed me to the couch like I was some stray dog, and sure, part of me wanted to protest, because what newlywed man wants to be banished to the sofa, but another part of me knew I couldn't rush her, not after everything she'd endured, so I swallowed my pride and accepted it, though I couldn't help teasing her by pulling her hand close under the warm lamplight, watching her puff up like a little pufferfish, cheeks pink, before shoving me away. And later that night, as I lay on the couch staring at the ceiling, I promised myself again that no matter how the story had been written, I would tear the script to shreds, because Emily Carter wasn't just the tragic mute heiress of some novel, she was my wife, and I would make sure her ending was rewritten with me by her side. And though I drifted off eventually, when I woke the next morning she was gone, the faint scent of her still lingering on the pillow, a single hair catching the sunlight, and I couldn't help but smile like an idiot, thinking, damn, I really scored the jackpot. But just as I was savoring that thought, a knock came at the door, and when I opened it, the last person I wanted to see was standing there, Vanessa Carter, smirking like a snake in the grass, and I knew instantly that the next round of this dangerous game was about to begin. The moment Vanessa Carter showed up at my door that morning, I knew trouble was brewing, because nothing good ever came from her fake sweet smile and calculating eyes, and sure enough she leaned casually against the frame, her gaze sliding to the faint trace of lipstick still on my cheek, and for a second her expression twisted before she masked it with a practiced pout. Brother-in-law, tomorrow Emily and I will be competing for a major project, and since you're technically family now, why don't you help me out by sneaking her presentation for me? Her tone honeyed but her words dripping with poison, and in my head I cursed, because in the original novel Ethan the simp had really done it, had actually stolen Emily's work to hand to Vanessa, leading to Emily's humiliating loss and eventually fueling the chain of events that ended with her death in the fire. But that wasn't going to happen on my watch. So I plastered on the most obedient smile I could muster and nodded like her loyal lapdog. Of course, Vanessa, I'll get it done, you can count on me. And she seemed satisfied, though her eyes lingered on my face a little too long, that lipstick mark making her jaw tighten, and she left with a smug little smirk that almost made me laugh out loud, because if only she knew what I was really planning, she'd be choking on her own schemes. So later that day, when Emily was preparing her slides, I made sure to copy them onto a USB drive, but instead of handing the real thing over, I doctored it, replacing the content with a folder full of explicit, rated material I'd sourced from the depths of the internet. And when the day of the presentation arrived, I played along, meeting Vanessa in the hallway outside the restroom and slipping the USB into her hand with a conspiratorial whisper, "Everything's here, you'll definitely win," and she glanced at me with that greedy gleam of victory, completely oblivious to the trap she was about to spring on herself. And then the meeting began, the boardroom filled with executives from Carter Holdings and potential investors, and Emily, my goddess of a wife, stood calmly at the front, her silence speaking louder than words as her assistant Jason clicked through the slides she had painstakingly prepared, every point concise, every chart crystal clear, so much so that even I, a total outsider to the business world, could follow along and feel impressed. And I could see the approving nods spreading across the faces of the old men in suits, their interest piqued, their expressions softening, while Vanessa sat in her chair looking more and more unsettled, until finally her turn came, and with her usual arrogance she strutted to the front, inserted the USB, and flashed me a confident smile, which I returned with the most reassuring nod I could fake, and then boom, screen lit up, not with financials or strategies, but with a full display of hardcore content that had half the room choking on their coffee and the other half scrambling to look away in disgust, and the silence that followed was deafening until the murmurs started, angry, scornful, humiliating, and Vanessa's face drained of color as she shrieked, "No, this isn't mine." Something went wrong, but her protests were useless, because in that kind of crowd the truth doesn't matter, perception is everything, and the perception was that she had just destroyed her credibility, and two senior board members, Mr. Johnson and Mr. Williams, stormed out in fury, declaring that such disgrace was unacceptable, leaving the project to fall effortlessly into Emily's hands. And while Vanessa trembled with rage, I leaned back in my chair, fighting to keep my grin under control, because watching her self-destruct had never felt so satisfying, but the real cherry on top was when Emily later cornered me back at the Carter estate, her eyes sharp as she pushed me against the wall and wrote in my palm with her fingertip, "Was it you?" And though part of me wanted to play innocent, the warmth in her gaze made me drop the act, so I cupped her face gently and murmured, "Don't thank me, Emily, it's my job as your husband," and for a second I saw something flicker in her eyes, something soft and fragile she quickly hid behind a playful little smile as she typed on her phone and showed me the screen. "Jason explained everything, looks like you have plenty of resources." And my face burned because damn it, I hadn't expected her to tease me like that, but beneath the embarrassment I felt a rush of happiness, because she wasn't pushing me away anymore, she was letting me in, little by little, and I wasn't about to screw that up. So when Vanessa texted me later that night, demanding answers, accusing me of sabotaging her, I slipped right back into character, feigning loyalty, telling her it was Emily's cunning, that we'd both fallen into her trap. And Vanessa, desperate to believe she still had me wrapped around her finger, swallowed it, vowing to find another chance, and I knew then that I had her exactly where I wanted her, because the more she thought I was hers, the easier it would be to ruin her from the inside. But before I could relish that victory too much, life threw another curveball, because out of nowhere I got a call from my so-called family, the ones who had sold me like cattle to the Carters, demanding that I come home. And against my better judgment I went, if only to see what fresh hell they were cooking up. And the moment I stepped into Gregory Reed's house, my mother Linda rushed over with false warmth, fussing over me as if she hadn't spent years watching me get bullied by my stepbrother Dylan without lifting a finger, and before I could sit down properly Dylan started in, his shrill voice grating on my nerves as he mocked me, calling me a sparrow pretending to be a phoenix, sneering that marrying a mute heiress wouldn't change the fact that I was trash, and I had to laugh, because this 24-year-old man-child had the nerve to look down on me when he couldn't even compare to one of my fingernails. So I leaned back, crossed my legs, and slowly looked him up and down before drawling, "Funny, because if anyone here looks like a sparrow, it's you," and his face turned purple as he lunged at me, only to trip over my outstretched leg and crash face-first onto the carpet, whining to Gregory like a toddler, "Dad." He hit me, and Gregory, who'd been lurking in the background waiting for a chance to play peacemaker, came rushing out with a forced smile, pretending to scold Dylan while turning to me with that patronizing tone, "Ethan, you're part of the Carter family now, surely you can help your brother by arranging a match with Emily's younger sister, Vanessa. They already like each other, all you need to do is say a few words, it's such a small thing." And my mother chimed in, "Yes, Ethan, we're family, it's your duty." And I swear I almost laughed in their faces, because the audacity was insane. They'd thrown me to the wolves for money and now they wanted me to pave Dylan's way into the Carters too, but instead of exploding I saw an opportunity, so I smiled and said, "Of course, but networking in the Carter family is expensive, better prepare at least $5 million as a start." And Dylan's eyes bugged out as he screeched, "$5 million? You might as well rob us." But Gregory, clearly terrified of losing his golden ticket, quickly nodded, promising to transfer the money immediately, and I walked out of that house humming, the taste of victory sweet on my tongue, only to nearly bump into Vanessa again outside, her eyes sharp as she asked what I was doing there, and inspiration struck, so I tugged on her sympathy, feigning panic, telling her Emily was starting to suspect me and that we needed to come up with a plan fast, even squeezing out a couple fake tears for good measure, and it worked like a charm, because she softened instantly, clutching my hand and pulling me along to discuss strategy, completely unaware that Dylan was lurking nearby watching us with a heartbroken expression, convinced I was stealing his so-called beloved, and I couldn't help smirking, because this was going to be fun. And by the time I got back to the Carter estate that evening, still grinning at the thought of Dylan's furious face, I opened the door to find Emily standing there, her arms crossed, her gaze cool, and on the table in front of her lay a series of candid photos of me with Vanessa at the cafe earlier, clearly taken by someone tailing me, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't know whether to laugh or panic, because Emily's poker face gave away nothing, but the tension in the room told me that the real storm was only just beginning. The moment I saw those photos spread out on the table I knew I was in deep trouble, because even though I had been careful to control the narrative with Vanessa, someone in the Carter estate had been watching me from the shadows and delivered the evidence straight to Emily, and she stood there with her perfect face carved from marble, not saying a word, but her silence was louder than 1,000 accusations, and I forced a weak smile, scratching the back of my neck as I asked lightly, "What's this, honey, are you jealous?" But she didn't laugh, she didn't even flinch. Instead she calmly tore the photos into tiny shreds, piece by piece, her expression unreadable except for the faint tension around her lips, and then she looked up at me with those deep eyes that seemed to see straight through my soul, and I swear for the first time since transmigrating into this world I felt guilty, not because I had betrayed her, I hadn't, not really, but because she deserved so much better than this charade. And before I could explain she suddenly stepped forward and bit my chin, hard enough to make me yelp, but before I could push her away she melted into my arms, her body pressed against mine, and I wrapped her up instinctively, thinking, damn, this woman was going to be the death of me, because she could wound me 1 second and make me crave her the next. And when I teased her by kissing the corner of her lips, whispering, "Thanks for the kiss, wife," she shoved me toward the couch again, punishing me with another night of loneliness, and I lay there grinning like an idiot, because even when she was mad she was still choosing me, still claiming me in her own way, and I knew I had to be patient, because walls built over years of betrayal weren't going to crumble overnight. So the next day when Vanessa called me whining about Dylan pressuring her to announce an engagement, I played my role, soothing her with sweet words while secretly laughing at how badly Dylan was spiraling, because apparently after seeing us together at the cafe he'd gone berserk, cornering her and demanding marriage like some deranged suitor, only for her to blow up at him, smash their so-called token of love, and walk away. And in his desperation he decided to use business leverage, trying to threaten her with deals she couldn't afford to lose. But Vanessa wasn't exactly powerless, and the two of them ended up in a screaming match that torpedoed both the relationship and the contract, leaving Dylan furious and humiliated. And when my informant Jason relayed this news to me I couldn't stop laughing, because it meant my stepbrother had just dug his own grave without me lifting a finger. But that laughter faded when Jason added that Dylan had shown up at Carter Holdings pretending to be me, trying to charm Emily with some pathetic imitation of my demeanor. And my blood boiled, because even though I had no claim over the past Ethan, the present Ethan was hers alone, and the idea of that fool leering at my wife made me want to break his face. So I rushed to the office, only to find Dylan already fleeing with tears in his eyes, clearly crushed under Emily's icy rejection. And when I stepped into her office I saw her sitting at her desk like a queen, radiating authority in a way I had rarely seen, her usual shyness around me replaced by the ruthless aura of the Carter heiress. And for a moment I just stared, mesmerized, thinking, damn, that's my wife. And when she saw me her expression softened instantly, as if the ruthless businesswoman had vanished and only the shy girl remained, and she walked straight into my arms, burying her face against my chest, typing on her phone with one hand and holding it up for me to read. "He tried to imitate you, but he was nothing but a cheap knockoff." And then she tilted her face up and kissed me, quick and hot, leaving me stunned and desperate for more. And from that day forward everything changed, because Emily, the woman once cold and distant, suddenly became clingy in the most adorable way. Wrapping her arms around me in the hallways, demanding kisses before meetings, curling into my side at night and refusing to let go. And I should have been worried about my cover with Vanessa, but honestly I was too busy basking in the warmth of having a wife who actually wanted me, and life turned into a haze of sweetness so intense even I started wondering if I was losing my edge. Until the day the Carter family gathered to officially decide the heir, and I walked into that hall with Emily's hand squeezed tightly in mine, my heart pounding as I imagined the showdown with Vanessa, only to nearly choke when Richard Carter, the patriarch himself, stood before the gathered relatives and calmly announced, "From today onward, Emily Carter will be the sole heir to Carter Holdings." Just like that, no battle, no contest, and I blinked in disbelief, waiting for Vanessa to storm in and throw a tantrum, but she never came, because as Emily explained later with that sly little smile of hers, Vanessa had already been exiled to a subsidiary company far from headquarters, her lack of education and polish finally catching up to her. And the more I thought about it the more I realized Emily had been quietly outmaneuvering her rival from the start, leaving her no chance to compete. And while the rest of the Carter family reluctantly applauded, I just sat there in awe, thinking, holy hell, my wife was terrifying. And I loved it, but my amazement didn't last long, because soon after I got word that Gregory and Dylan had vanished, no longer showing their faces around me, and though it might have looked like they'd given up, I knew men like them never disappeared quietly, which meant Emily had probably arranged for their exit in a way that left them unable to crawl back, and while part of me felt vindicated on behalf of the original Ethan who had suffered under their cruelty, another part of me worried, because if Emily was this ruthless to her enemies, what would she do if she ever decided I was one of them? But that thought evaporated when I came home one evening and found her waiting with the softest smile, slipping her hand into mine and leading me down the hall like we'd been married for years, and as we walked I caught sight of a figure by the gates, a woman older, worn down, with familiar eyes brimming with tears. Linda Reed, my biological mother, the one who had abandoned me to Gregory's cruelty, and my heart twisted, not because I wanted her back, but because the memory of the original Ethan surged in me, his pain, his longing for a mother's love, and she grabbed my hand, sobbing, "Son, I'm sorry, I had no choice, I had to survive," and for a moment I stood frozen, but then I pulled my hand away, my voice flat as I told her, "Go home," because I wasn't the boy she had betrayed anymore, and when I turned back Emily was standing there 10 steps away, watching quietly, no judgment in her eyes, only patience, and she held out her hand, waiting, and I walked over and laced my fingers with hers, because that was my real family now, the only one that mattered, and as the sun set behind us I realized that I had finally severed the last ties of the past, and that the future, for better or worse, belonged to me and Emily alone, but deep down I also knew that Vanessa wasn't done, not by a long shot, and the next time she appeared it wouldn't just be embarrassing photos or failed presentations, it would be war, and I had to be ready to fight it by Emily's side. For a while after Emily was officially declared heir to Carter Holdings, life felt almost too good to be true, like I had somehow stumbled into the honeymoon phase I never thought I'd get, because she turned into the sweetest kind of clingy wife, curling into me at night, demanding hugs and kisses in broad daylight, texting me little notes even when we sat across the same table, and every time she did something so uncharacteristically cute, I couldn't help thinking that if the old Ethan had ever gotten even a fraction of this affection, he never would have betrayed her. But of course good things never last forever, and it wasn't long before Vanessa Carter reappeared, claws sharpened and pride bruised, determined to crawl her way back into relevance, and she started small, sending me cryptic messages late at night, trying to guilt-trip me into meeting her. But I ignored them until one day she cornered me at the company gym, eyes flashing with desperation as she hissed, "You promised to help me, Ethan, have you forgotten our deal?" And I played dumb, smirking as I adjusted my watch. "What deal? You mean the one where you end up marrying my stepbrother? Because last I checked that's the only ending you deserve," and the way her face twisted almost made me laugh, but I held it back because I knew she wasn't harmless anymore, she was dangerous, a cornered snake, and sure enough the very next week she orchestrated a stunt at a Carter Holdings charity gala, where she strutted in wearing a show-stopping dress, making sure every camera was pointed at her, and then pretended to trip right into my arms just as the press snapped away, creating a perfect storm of scandalous headlines implying an affair between the legitimate heiress's husband and the illegitimate daughter, and though I played it off coolly, making jokes to the reporters and ushering Emily away like nothing had happened, I could feel the whispers following us like smoke, and I hated it, hated that Vanessa could still worm her way into our lives with such cheap tricks, but what rattled me more was Emily's reaction. Because instead of exploding with jealousy she simply leaned into me, holding my arm tighter, her eyes calm as a lake as if to say, "Do you think I'd ever let her take you from me?" And that quiet confidence shook me more than any rage would have, because it meant she trusted me, fully, maybe even more than I deserved, and in that moment I vowed again that I would never betray her trust, not even for appearances, not even to keep the cover with Vanessa going, which meant I had to find a way to cut Vanessa off completely. But before I could put that plan into motion Dylan decided to pop back into my life like a bad penny, this time drunk and loud at a downtown bar, screaming about how I had stolen his woman, his chance, his life, and when he lunged at me with a broken bottle I didn't even have to lift a finger because security hauled him out like the trash he was, but the incident still made the gossip rounds, further tarnishing the Reed name, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Vanessa had set the whole thing up to drag me down, so. Later that night when I confronted her through text, she didn't even deny it, just replied, "You owe me, Ethan. Don't forget who you're supposed to be helping," and my hands tightened around the phone because in another life maybe she could have fooled me, Maybe the old Ethan was dumb enough to believe she actually cared, but this version of me wasn't playing her game anymore, and when I turned my head Emily was watching from the doorway, her expression unreadable, holding her phone like she had been tracking the conversation all along. And instead of questioning me she just walked over, typed a few words into her notes app, and showed me, "Next time, let me handle her," and the smirk that tugged at her lips was so cold it made even me shiver, because for all her angelic beauty my wife had a steel blade hidden inside her, and I realized she wasn't planning on simply surviving Vanessa's schemes, she was planning on ending them permanently, so when the next big corporate competition loomed, Emily prepared like a general going to war, and I stood by her side, offering whatever help I could. Even if it was just running interference on the gossip swirling around, and sure enough Vanessa tried again, bribing a few middle managers to sabotage Emily's presentation, but thanks to my habit of keeping Jason close and bribed even closer, we caught wind of it early and turned the tables, exposing the corruption right in the middle of the meeting, humiliating Vanessa so badly she nearly fainted. And afterward as Emily and I rode home in the back of the limo, she leaned against me, tracing circles on my hand with her fingertip before writing in her app, "You're mine now, all mine," and I kissed her hair, whispering, "Always," but deep down I knew this was only the calm before the real storm, because Vanessa wasn't just some petty rival anymore, she was backed into a corner, and people like her fought hardest when they had nothing left to lose, and as I stared out the window at the city lights flickering like fire, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that sooner or later those flames would reach us, and I had to be ready to walk through them hand in hand with Emily, no matter the cost. I thought after that disastrous meeting where Vanessa was publicly exposed for bribing executives she would finally back down, maybe disappear quietly into whatever corner Richard Carter had shoved her into, but clearly I underestimated her desperation, because a week later she resurfaced like a ghost that refused to stay buried, her strategy no longer subtle sabotage but all-out psychological warfare. And it started when tabloids suddenly exploded with blurry photos of me leaving a cafe with her, edited in a way that made it look like we were holding hands, and the headlines screamed scandal, questioning my loyalty to Emily and even daring to call me the wandering husband of the Carter heiress, and at first I wanted to smash the reporters' cameras, but Emily just glanced at the news, scoffed, and tossed her phone aside, curling into me on the couch like nothing had happened, and that calm nearly broke me. Because it wasn't indifference, it was trust, absolute and terrifying, and I knew that if I ever let her down for real, it would destroy her, so I swore again that I would not let Vanessa's games shake us, yet Vanessa clearly wasn't satisfied with planting rumors, because the very next Carter family banquet she pulled the boldest move yet, strutting into the grand hall in a silver gown that glittered under the chandeliers, ignoring every etiquette rule as she raised a glass and called out across the crowd, "Brother-in-law, won't you toast with me?" her voice dripping honey as she tried to drag me into her charade, and I could feel hundreds of eyes snap to me, waiting for my reaction, waiting for a scandal, but before I could open my mouth Emily was already moving, stepping in front of me in her sleek black dress like a shield, her lips curving into the faintest smile as she said, not with words but with presence alone, that she dared anyone to challenge her claim, and Vanessa froze, glass trembling in her hand as Emily leaned closer, whispering something only she could hear, and whatever it was, it drained the color from Vanessa's face, because she slammed her glass down and stormed out, humiliated again, and when I tried to ask Emily later what she had said she just smiled mysteriously, typing into her phone, "Secrets are more fun, aren't they?" and I groaned, half annoyed, half turned on, because my wife was getting dangerously good at this game, but Vanessa wasn't done yet, oh no, because that same night Dylan showed up at the Carter estate. Drunk out of his mind, screaming Emily's name like some lovesick fool, and when security dragged him to the gate he ranted that Vanessa had promised him a future, that she had sworn she would marry him once she took control, and in that moment I realized Vanessa had been playing both sides, dangling herself as bait to Dylan while trying to drag me into her mess, hoping to shatter the entire Carter family dynamic and come out on top, but what she didn't realize was that Emily wasn't just defending herself anymore, she was building an empire brick by brick, and I was her willing partner, so the next morning when Vanessa tried to corner me in the office again, I didn't even bother pretending loyalty, I looked her dead in the eyes and said quietly, "Vanessa, you lost the second you tried to use me against my wife, and now the only thing you can choose is how ugly your fall will be. And the way her lips quivered told me she finally believed me, though that didn't stop her from trying one last desperate strike, because a few days later she bribed an assistant to leak Emily's confidential project files, only to discover too late that Emily had anticipated it, planting false information that backfired spectacularly, leaving Vanessa blacklisted from half the business community overnight. And when she realized the walls were closing in, she turned to her last weapon: public opinion, standing in front of cameras, crying crocodile tears about being mistreated by the Carter family, painting herself as the poor illegitimate daughter bullied by the rich heiress and her cruel husband, and for a moment the media bought it, but Emily didn't flinch. She simply called a press conference of her own, walked onto the stage in a white suit like a queen, and without saying a word she handed out documents proving Vanessa's bribes, fraud, and embezzlement, receipts so damning the entire room fell silent, and then she looked straight into the cameras and signed her name, claiming full responsibility as the Carter Holdings heir, and the applause that followed was deafening, drowning out Vanessa's career once and for all. And as I stood in the wings watching my wife stand victorious, radiant and untouchable, I felt a surge of pride so strong it almost knocked me off my feet, because this was the woman I had once underestimated, once thought of as weak, and now she was the one rewriting not just her fate but mine too. And that night when we got home she didn't send me to the couch. She pulled me into bed, wrapped her arms around my neck, and whispered with her newly healed voice, husky and beautiful, "Ethan, you're mine, forever." And I kissed her like my life depended on it, knowing deep down that though Vanessa was finished, our story wasn't over yet, because power like Emily's came with enemies, and the fire that had once been written as her end was still flickering in the shadows, waiting for its chance, and I had no intention of letting it consume her this time, not when I'd already chosen to walk through it at her side. After that night when Emily finally whispered with her own voice that I was hers forever, I thought maybe the story was finished, that the last page had turned and we'd ride off into some kind of happily ever after, but the world doesn't work like that, not in real life and definitely not in the kind of twisted novel I'd been thrown into, because the embers of the fire that was once written as Emily's fate hadn't gone out. They were just waiting, smoldering in the dark, and I felt it every time we walked into a boardroom, every time we stepped out of the Carter estate into the flashing cameras, every time I caught whispers about the mute heiress turned queen, and I knew there would always be people lurking, people jealous, people greedy, who wanted to see her fall, but the difference was now she wasn't standing alone, she had me, and I wasn't letting go, not now, not ever. So when the first signs of a new storm appeared, anonymous letters delivered to Carter Holdings threatening to expose fabricated scandals about Emily, I didn't panic, I laughed, because whoever thought they could scare her clearly hadn't been watching, and Emily just raised an eyebrow, tossed the letters to Jason to archive, and kissed me on the cheek before heading to her meeting like it was any other Tuesday, but I couldn't shake the feeling this wasn't over, and sure enough a week later our penthouse caught fire. The alarms blaring at 3 in the morning, smoke flooding the hallways, and in that moment my blood turned to ice, because this was it. This was the scene the original novel had promised, the fire that was supposed to consume Emily while the loyal dog Ethan ran to save Vanessa, but not this time, not in this life, because I didn't hesitate. I grabbed Emily, wrapped her in my arms, and barreled through the flames with her pressed against me, coughing, choking, but never letting go. And when we stumbled into the street surrounded by firefighters and flashing lights, I saw her staring up at me with tears streaming down her soot-streaked face, whispering hoarsely, "You really chose me," and I laughed bitterly, pulling her close. Of course I did, what kind of idiot wouldn't? And in that instant I knew the script had been burned away with the flames, that the tragedy written for her had been rewritten with my stubborn refusal to let her go, and later when the investigators confirmed the fire had been arson, Emily didn't even flinch, she just typed on her phone and showed me one word, Vanessa, and I nodded because of course it was her, because cornered snakes always strike with poison as their last act, and sure enough the evidence piled up until she was dragged away in handcuffs, screaming curses at us, and for the first time since I'd arrived in this world I felt true relief, like the shadow that had hung over us since the beginning had finally been banished, and life after that settled into a rhythm that was both ordinary and extraordinary, because while the world saw Emily Carter, the brilliant heir of Carter Holdings, dazzling in boardrooms and commanding respect, I got to see the softer side, the woman who hogged the blanket at night, who blushed when I teased her, who pouted if I didn't kiss her goodbye before work, and every day I woke up next to her I thought about the poor fool who once lived in this body, the Ethan who never saw what he had. And I silently promised him that I would make it up to her for both of us, that she would never doubt her worth again, and one evening months later, when the sun set behind the Manhattan skyline and painted the world gold, Emily stood on the balcony in her silk robe, her hair glowing in the light, and she turned to me with a smile that made my chest ache, whispering with the voice she'd fought so hard to regain, "Ethan, thank you for changing my ending," and I wrapped my arms around her, pressing my forehead to hers, and whispered back, "No, Emily, thank you for giving me a beginning, because I knew deep down that this wasn't just her story anymore, it was ours, tangled, messy, fiery, and beautiful, and whatever challenges waited ahead, whatever enemies we still had to face, I was done running, done hiding, because I wasn't just the background character doomed to lose everything, I was her husband, her partner, her shield, and together we had rewritten the script, torn the old pages to shreds, and started writing our own, one kiss, one battle, one promise at a time, and this time, the ending would be ours to choose.